And following that, I'd like to invite our first guest who will address the topic, Disinformation and Policies, Mr. Tavares, who is the president of SaferNet, and he's chairman of CGI.br, and he'll be the moderator of this next panel. And Mrs. Cockbunny, who is a professor of law and governance at the University of Utrecht. She was the president of the high-level group of the European Commission on fake news and disinformation online and offline. Mr. Tavares, our moderator, you have the floor. Thank you. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. You are mostly welcome to participate at our second seminar addressing disinformation and democracy. Let me briefly address our activities in the CGI. The topic chosen to be addressed here today is based on the Internet Committee since the end of 2017. At that time, the committee was invited by the Court of Appeal to participate at a seminar which was conducted by the court in the federal capital, Brasilia. At that time, we were enchanted to participate, and with that, we started debating that topic internally as part of the committee's agenda. Back in 2018, that same committee put together a seminar which was held at the same very premises where a multi-sectorial perspective was given considering disinformation as part of the political scenario. We know that the election setting and disinformation is not a aspect which is just restricted to some electoral process and the political domain. Disinformation goes much beyond that. It has impact at several levels in the public setting and the health scenario. In São Paulo, there is that outbreak of measles, and people, they are no longer vaccinating, some people, I mean, and that led to this outbreak, and this is a consequence of disinformation campaigns against vaccines, as if vaccines, they would be harmful to our population. That leads to a number of consequences in the health sector. But this is just one example. There are many others that could be here shared to make you understand at what extent the disinformation campaigns, fake news, advertising, and different conspiring theories and different formats that all these contents, they can be so harmful and they can lead to very negative consequences to the society as a whole. Therefore, last year's CGI focus was to collaborate to all these initiatives that were conducted by the federal court, address integrity of our elections, to understand at what extent disinformation may affect election process, and to collaborate somehow to that task force. Our committee put together a consultant committee about decisions to be made during elections, and CGI and ICBR were both invited and participated at several meetings that were held in our federal capital. And somehow we collaborated to put together the draft of this textbook, which is available outside for your further reading. And the aim is to point out best international practices as well as practices that can be adopted to the Brazilian context. This is a product of a workshop that was conducted by CGI and which took place right after our first seminar. And tomorrow there will be a second workshop, which is also part of that joint effort. CGI decisions are guided by our manual of 10 principles. Such principles, they encompasses, as it says, 10 of those principles, which probably most of you are aware of, but let's remind some of those principles which are extremely relevant and should be part of this debate. Principle number 1, which is the opening chapter addressing freedom, privacy, and human rights. The use of internet should be guided by freedom of expression, privacy of our subjects, and respecting human rights. And they should be acknowledged as key to preserve a fair and democratic society, as well as some other principles, such as the collaborative and democratic principles. Internet governance should be conducted in a very clear and transparent and multi-sectoral way based on democracy, including several sectors of the society participation, improving that collective type of actions, as well as cultural diversity that should be preserved, and its expression should be motivated without any imposition of beliefs, values, innovation, network neutrality, transparent network, and that is also part of CGI principles. We have to defeat any illegal process that should be part in the web, preserve greater and major principles advocating for right for privacy and respect to human rights, and last but not least important, functionality, security and stability, and a legal and regulatory environment to all. Based on these 10 principles available at the CGI website, we guide our decisions. That works as our guideline or as a filter. Any type of decision made by the committee should be aligned to those 10 principles addressed in that manual, which somehow inspired our legal civil framework once that was established back in 2009. Having said those few words to put that topic into a context, I'd like to introduce Professor Madeleine de Buning. She's a professor at Utrecht University in the Netherlands. She was the lead professor on digital politics, economic and societies, and she was also a chair of the European Regulators Group for Audiovisual Media Services. Professor Buning, she's also a professor at the EUI Schools of Transnational Governance, STG, where she leads all sorts of efforts in digital politics, economy, and societies. She has great experience in researching and understanding the impact of media in the European Union, as well as new policies. And she was also chair of the Audiovisual Media Services, as he has said before, and also chair of the European Commission High-Level Expert Group, which is a group of experts in charge to address a report about disinformation and fake news, assigned to provide options on how to react to the dissemination of fake news both online and offline in Europe. And she's also an honorary judge to the Court of Appeal in The Hague, and also as a chair of the advisory committee as a commissioner to the Dutch Media Authority. With that, it's a great honor to have Professor Buning among us today.
Thank you so much for accepting our invitation, and you have the floor for your presentation. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and it's so wonderful to be here. But I want to start off with a congratulations, 30 years, 30 wonderful years. I think you can be extremely proud of your wonderful work, the 30 years, which is so important. Sorry for this long CV of mine. Maybe you have already fallen asleep. But I will try to keep you awake by my presentation on disinformation and democracy. So let's start off with a poll. So who did ever buy fake news? Who ever thought this is correct, but in fact it was fake news? So raise your hands. Almost everyone. So also we here that are considered to be more or less experts on these kinds of topics, we also fall for fake news. And then who here was ever the subject of fake news? Also a bit less. Well, good for you guys, because I can tell you from experience it's not so nice to be the subject of fake news, but it happens. So this is the phenomenon we will be talking about. But, you know, what is fake news? Is fake news a journalistic blunder? I took this really old picture of Truman, who in fact did win the American elections. And then unfortunately the Chicago Daily Tribune said that it was not Truman, but Dewey that would have defeated him. So this was a journalistic blunder, a big one. Imagine you just, you know, put the button down and, okay, this is the newspaper with this heading we're going to print. And in fact, the next day it turned out to be wrong because it was Truman, the Democrat, that did win and not the Dewey, the Republican. So this is also to indicate that we are dealing with a very old phenomenon. Things can go wrong in the media. And this is what we have seen, sometimes intentionally, and like in this case, non-intentionally. But what kind of problem or phenomenon are we dealing with if we talk about fake news? Well, of course, a very famous person using the word fake news a lot is, of course, Donald Trump. And he talks about fake news media. According to him, media are sending out fake news, especially if they are critical towards him. So fake news is a specific category of media. And I have something to show you what also... Oh, aha.
We were way up in Pennsylvania, and there was only 2% of the vote left. And we were way up. If I lost every vote, we would have won the state of Pennsylvania. And the fake news refused to call it, right? They refused to call it. So here was the story by the fake news. The president was 15 minutes late for the Queen. Wrong. And then here's the rest of the story. No, here's the rest. Here's the rest of the story. So they said I was late when I was actually early, number one. Number two, I guess the meeting was scheduled for 15 minutes, and it lasted for almost an hour. The president overstayed. So I was late and I overstayed, and honestly, folks, it was such a beautiful, beautiful visit and afternoon. but they can make anything bad because they are the fake, disgusting news.
Thank you. So what you would see is that news media are considered to be fake news and even disgusting news media. So this is what you could see if you look at the word fake news. And this is why we, as the high-level group on disinformation, that was the group of experts and leaders of platforms that was created by the European Commission in 2018, with the very difficult task to grasp the phenomenon and to come up with sensible solutions to it. So we decided, after these kind of, use of the word of fake news, that we better use another word, and that was disinformation. That is what we use. So that is why we rather talk about disinformation. So you will hear me talk about disinformation, and of course, being a lawyer, I need to have a definition of disinformation, and this is also the definition you can read in our report of the high-level expert group on disinformation. If you just type in the word, you can easily find it online, so you can reread also our definition. What is disinformation according to us? It's false, inaccurate, or misleading information that is deliberately created and disseminated for economic benefits or to harm a person, social group, organization, or country, including manipulating the public opinion. But be sure, disinformation, and that is very relevant if you want to look at solutions, it is not illegal or unlawful content. So it is not hate speech, it's not incitement to violence. That is not where we were talking about when we spoke about disinformation. It's also not parody, it's also not comedians making fun of things, that's also not considered to be disinformation, and it is neither bad journalism. So this is to make sure that we're dealing with a category that is much smaller than the category that is sometimes put on the word of fake news or disinformation. So, let's go on. Because disinformation is from all times. We know very well that this phenomenon of photos being manipulated, information which is factually incorrect, is very an old phenomenon. So why do we now bother? Why is it such a very important societal issue right now? Well, you can see a medium, you see a Connect TV here with a lot of, different applications that are used, and they are, according to me at least, they are representing the online world, the digital world that is so important with regard to the topic of disinformation. Disinformation can have enormous effects. We have seen, for instance, that in Pakistan and India, almost it started a war. There was a suicide bomber in Kashmir, the Indian province, that actually got, he killed 40 militaries, and then there was the word spread that it was the Pakistan army that did that. And then a new word that was spread is that an F-16 was shot down in Pakistan by India. So this is a lethal combination because there is already a lot of tension between these countries. So if disinformation would have been trusted, this could have fired quite some things. So that is one element. But that is then the impact. But the impact is even larger if you looked at the scale and the speed of distribution. If there is diverse news consumption, it's not as bad, but if it's not that diverse, you will see that it is extremely influential, especially if you are inside of a filter bubble. Because if you are inside of a filter bubble, which is, for instance, within your WhatsApp group or on the timeline of Facebook, and you will be reinforced constantly with the same kind of information, and that will become your own truth. And if then, as a citizen, you are not in the position to also look into other sources, like a diverse consumption of media, or they're either because there is no diverse media anymore in the country, or because you're not interested, because you read the news through WhatsApp or through your Facebook timeline, then impact will be much bigger, because normally disinformation, who cares? A little bit of disinformation is not such a big deal. The deal is that when we start believing the disinformation, when the impact is really big, then we will get into problems. And this is something which is very interesting and very important if you look, this is the context if you want to look into solutions. Now let me talk a little bit more about the filter bubble. That is the research for maybe some of you that don't know, but probably most of you will have heard of the filter bubble. It is the result of a personalized search by which a website algorithm selectively determines what information the user would like to see based on information about that user. And maybe you guys are not in a filter bubble, but you could experiment on getting into a filter bubble. Just, keep on liking specific messages on specific topics, and you will end up in a filter bubble quite fast. I've tried it once for 2 weeks, and then I created my own little filter bubble, which was super interesting also from a perspective of learning about how the problem works. And then another issue with regard to this is that, of course, the platforms, which are super important here, they are not transparent about their algorithms, so we don't know how it works. As consumers, we are left in the dark of the functioning of how these algorithms work. Well, of course, a super relevant and well-known topic is the Facebook Cambridge Analytica example, where you did see that private data through the apps, through the use of apps by Cambridge Analytica, was used to target disinformation campaigns towards specific groups. There is evidence that these campaigns were used in 2015 and 2016 towards Trump and Ted Cruz, 2016 towards the Brexit vote, and 2018 the Mexican general election for the Institutional Revolutionary Party. So we have evidence that that is used for that. However, there is research that indicates that it was not the tilting point, in fact, that these filter bubbles were filled with people that were already believer of a certain perspective. So those were already the pro-Brexit or already the pro-Trump voters that were just inside of their filter bubbles, but they didn't really change their mind because the filter bubble didn't become larger. And this evidence is given by Oxford Reuters, which is something I can really recommend to you. That is worldwide research to disinformation campaigns, and it also looks at the effects. So that is about Facebook Cambridge Analytica as an example. But now, of course, the very relevant question is, do we have in our democracies somehow a right to fact-checked or correct information? Can we construe that from case law, for instance, of the European Court of Human Rights? Well, let me look into this with you guys for a second. First, the Handyside case, already 1976, it says that it was with regard to a British government that banned the publication of a book by the publisher Handyside, and it had explicit information about sexuality. Well, here the court already said, well, okay, maybe it's a little bit uncomfortable, this sexually explicit information, and it might be considered offensive by a large part of the population, but no, you cannot prohibit it. That would be against the Treaty for Human Rights. So that's the first element we can use. And then we have the Salif case, and in the Salif case, it deals with a Ukrainian journalist, Salif. He was prosecuted by criminal law by national authorities for publishing information about the president that was incumbent at that time, which was not based on truth. To say this might have been considered disinformation or fake news, however you want to mention it. But there the court said, okay, this might not be true, but still, according to the right to the freedom of expression, it is not limited to only truthful information. So also untruthful information is protected by human rights. So this is something to consider if you want to act against information that might be untruthful. Although it can be very harmful, there is, at least according to the European Court of Human Rights, and as you might know, the Council of Europe also includes Russia, for instance, and 47 countries in total, so it is a rather relevant human rights court, I would say. Then you would have the Lingens case, and there it was an Austrian authority that prosecuted a journalist for insulting a counselor, and there also the court held, well, it is, although maybe not so nice, it is possible that you also insult authorities, so also insulting would fall under the freedom of expression. So, and then the Buning case, we're almost ready, so don't worry. 2 more cases. There it said that the anti-abortion activist Bowman was banned from distributing pamphlets about the views on abortion of candidates a few weeks before the election, and she was very much against abortion, and they were rather confrontational, bloody kind of pamphlets. And there also the court ruled, okay, free election and freedom of expression, in particular freedom of political debate, together with forms of foundation of a democratic system, they need to be protected, especially before elections. And then the last case I want to talk about with you guys is the Iskra case. A regional newspaper reported a month before the election about the abuse of power of a local governor that was connected to President Putin. And there, the first time ever, and the last time so far, the court said, okay, this is allowed. The freedom of expression protects also this kind of fake news kind of information, but also journalists have like a positive obligation to act in good faith. So this was the first time where you see a little bit of tilting point that the court actually said, well, you know, journalists will have to abide ethical rules. Although even if they don't, still they are protected under the freedom of expression. So this, just for you guys to have a context, this is reality on the case law of the European Court of Justice. So here's the conclusion, but we will skip that because I already explained that. And then I go back. So on the one hand, we see freedom of expression really is super important and will be relevant for this information, no matter what, also for the future. And then there is another element that is super relevant, and that is the element of the mushrooms. The mushroom analogy, I always like to use that. If you would like to go to the source of this information, you would cut that off, it would grow up somewhere else, right? So there would be like, it would be a battle that would continue constantly. I don't know whether you have mushrooms in your garden. I am Dutch, so of course I have them because we are under the water level. And then if you cut them down, they will grow up somewhere else. So cutting down the source is maybe not a good idea for 2 reasons. One, human rights, and the second one would be they grow up somewhere else anyway, because the troll factories are very resourceful. But then, what to do? And I want to bring a context in the discussion, and that is that there is a very strong intertwining of the trust decay and the truth decay. Because if we believe our institutions, then this information will be not so effective. But what we see is we lose trust in institutions more and more. And that is also a very relevant element for combating disinformation. Because if you would only be combating disinformation, and then we would all still not trust the source of disinformation or the source of correct information, then it will not be really useful to do something against the disinformation, because you don't want to trust the true information anymore, because you don't trust the institutions. So this is a very dangerous kind of a tango that's going on between the trust decay and the truth decay. So what would be the drivers of these elements? So first of all, what you would say is for the change of in the information ecosystem, of course. So that is a raise of information volume, including disinformation. It's just much more information going on, and that's not just fact-check information or information which is factual, but a lot of more of opinions. And opinions and facts are also sometimes mixed up. So that's one thing. Secondly, there's the so-called cognitive bias. That is that if you are reading something that you like or you agree with, you will probably want to read other stuff which is similar. And then the algorithm with the filter bubble we just spoke about helps you to further that reinformation cognitive bias. And then the third element in the changes of the information ecosystem, which is super important in so many other countries, is that what you would see is that traditional media are struggling to survive, because they feel strong competition in the advertisement market of the large platforms, of Facebook, of YouTube, of Twitter. There you can sell advertisements much more easy nowadays than you could do in your traditional newspaper or in your broadcasting station. So there is a strong competition, and because of this strong competition, it is more and more important to have eyeballs as a media institution, which means that you have people that actually watch your messages. Aha! And looking now again at this cognitive bias and also the emotional need for us and our curiosity if we see bad news about someone, or if we see a message, a baby is born, and I hope it's not the case for you, that is 15 kilo upon birth, then we will click on that, right? And then you will get more audience. And this is also a way traditional media sometimes need to survive, also to be purifiers of disinformation, because we just like disinformation as consumers. So this makes it like, you know, the changes in the information ecosystem are super important. Then another element of this driver of the truth decay and the trust decay would be the polarization. We see a polarization in society, an increasing a disagreement about at facts. So this is a fact which is from the other side, and of course we don't believe it because the other side comes up with that fact. And this is something we see in all countries around the world, at least almost all countries going on, not just in, for instance, the United States or in Poland. We see that all over the place. And groups become insular to communication, creating a closed environment, for instance, through WhatsApp. Okay. And then, of course, the last element, I already mentioned it, is a loss of trust in institutions. It used to be super important if you could say, I'm a judge to the Court of Appeal. But now, even courts are not considered to be authoritative anymore. Science, why would we believe science? I mean, also with regard to vaccination, your kid could become ill getting a vaccine. This is what I read, so why would we believe science anymore? So that's going down. So, and also professional media, and they help a little bit. I just explained that in the first element. And then, of course, governments that also sometimes use disinformation to get voters. Okay, so, given the fact that these are drivers, and I will talk about disinformation within 1 minute, but there's something I really would like to point out. Given the fact that these are entwined, it's very important that also institutions are transparent and accountable, because otherwise there will be this bias of not wanting to believe what authorities say anymore, and you will come into this very nasty tango with each other. Here it is. So we just spoke about trust in institutions, and now we go to trust in media and trust decay. And here I have some digits about Brazil even. And here we are really close together, but also as far as possible. And this is, I think, a shocking piece of data. It's data from Oxford Reuters, with whom I'm working together. And that says, looking at a review by audiences, that the proportion of people that say that they are very or extremely concerned about what is real and what is fake on the internet when it comes to news, you would see that the Netherlands is on the far, for you guys, right-hand side, and Brazil is on the far left-hand side, which means that Dutch normally would believe what they would read online. They don't worry so much. And Brazilians worry very much. 85% of Brazilians are not sure whether what they're reading is trustworthy or not. So what you could say is like those Dutch were so naive, right? Or you could say, and the Brazilians are, you know, super smart, they take care. But this can also be an indication of a general distrust in media. And if there's a general distrust in media and in online media, this is extremely dangerous, because then the watchdog role is in fact muzzled, right? The muzzle is a thing you put above on a dog's mouth if it can bark or if it can bite too hard. And of course, media are there to, as a fundamental pillar in our democracy, to keep the power accountable. And if we don't believe any media anymore, the accountable one or the disinformation one, then this fundamental pillar under our democracy is gone. And this is why I found it so shocking to find this out. And this was also one of the reasons why I wanted to come to Brazil to talk to you guys about this phenomenon. Because this is something I can imagine we would want to work on. Because we want to have strong media to be a good watchdog to, well, the government. Either this government or another government, every government, it's super important that the media can play its role. Because otherwise it's very difficult to have a democracy, we know. So I'm here with a silver bullet. No, I'm not, I'm afraid. Because there is no silver bullet. And that is it's a pity. And it has a reason. Because disinformation is a multifaceted problem. So it needs to have a multi-dimensional solution. And this is also what we came up to as the high-level group on disinformation of the European Commission. And this is the front of our report, and we were extremely happy when we finished it. And it was a long way, I can tell you. I think the process was a little bit like your 10 principles, and I'm so impressed that you guys were able to create those 10 wonderful principles. And we tried to do something similar. So I will talk about it also, the process. I'm wondering if you see some similarities there. Okay, so it was a group of 39 members, which is quite a large group, I must say, and it was an extremely diverse group. Civil society, social media platforms, and then, you know, the people that were a bit higher in hierarchy, so they could actually decide, which was useful for us. News media, academia, they were all around the table, and everyone around the table hated the platforms. So when I started chairing this, I thought, okay, how are we going to come to a compromise? Because everyone is hating the platform, and then we need the platforms to step up to play, so how are we going to get there? We had a meeting, because we just had 2 months, which was really super short. We had a meeting in the beginning of halfway of January last year, and there was already some action taken by the European Commission. There is this young and talented European Commissioner, which is called Maria Gabriel, and she really wanted to tackle this issue of disinformation in Europe. This issue was felt to be stronger a problem on the borders of Europe, which were nearer to Russia than some other parts, like in the Netherlands, as you have seen, because we just, you know, we believe our media somehow. But still, there was like a strong pressure towards disinformation, because there was also, of course, the risk that disinformation would, at the end of the day, manipulate European elections, and European elections coming up, as you know, they have been there, are extremely important to keep Europe together, to avoid Europe falling apart. So this was our task. We were supposed to advise the Commission on the scoping of the phenomenon, We would define the roles and responsibilities of all relevant stakeholders, and we would grasp the international dimension and taking position of all the stock of all the positions at stake, which was quite a lot. And then we had to formulate recommendations. So this, and we had only had 2 months time to do that. So how the hell would we start doing that? So I used 2 things. First of all, I used a philosopher of law, especially for Giuliano, because you're a philosopher yourself. And his name is John Rawls. Did you ever hear maybe of him? John Rawls has this analogy of the veil of ignorance. And ignorance is not stupid, but it is that you are ignorant of your original position. So all those people around the table were representing a specific interest. And I told to them, you know, we have 2 months the time to come up with a good solution for this information. And if we are failing, be sure that the Commission will come up with a solution that neither of you will actually like. So this is a great opportunity, but it requires you to put over the veil of ignorance and forget your original position and come up with the optimal solution, no matter what your position is. And somehow the people bought that. They actually decided that this was a good idea. So they were, and sometimes they fell back, of course, like, oh yeah, but it's not interest of my company to do that. And then I said, remember, we had 2 months, a veil of ignorance, just go for it. So that was very useful. So one element was the pressure cooker. So we just had 2 months, so they had to really make progress. And the other element was John Rawls with the veil of ignorance. So we came up with a report. And the report was, first of all, the problem definition. Well, you can read it all if you download it. It took stock of all the measures already taken, because I thought it would be a good idea if the platforms and then the media companies and the journalists would just already indicate what they were proud of, to have like a positive atmosphere around the table. And they came up with quite a lot. Of course, civil society was super critical, so most, I think, like 50% of those examples of good practices was killed because they said this is not a good practice, in fact, but okay, 50% was left. Then we came up with the key principles, of course, based on the human right balance and the safety balance, because on the one hand you have, of course, the human rights, but on the other hand you have the very important security element of protecting the elections in both the member state and the European elections. And then we formulated 5 responses and actions. First, transparency, then media literacy, then empowerment of users and journalists, then diversity and sustainability of the media landscape, and then a process of evaluation, because research is very important. And I will talk about that a little bit more. And I have a slide for that, because what we did is, since it is a problem with many elements, we also came up with a multifaceted solution. We start at the pink part, so the protection of the diversity and sustainability of the news and media ecosystem. And if you have listened to me just now and didn't fall asleep yet, you could have noticed that it's super important that you can be, as a consumer, a fact checker of the news you actually see. And therefore it is important that there is a diverse media offer. You need to find out if this is really true or if the reality is different. So we have to somehow find ways of protecting this diverse media landscape, and at least avoid that the diversity is killed by competition of, for instance, platform advertisers. Second, and this is of course something we can already all start doing, promote and organize media and information literacy. And not just for kids, because those kids are smarter than you would think, but especially also for the current voters. Elderly people, but also people of our ages, are not always aware of that they actually are in an information bubble, because they're not aware that there is such a thing as an information bubble. They're not aware of the diversity, of the importance of just also checking the other information. And sometimes they're also not aware of the fact that news can cost something. And if we all realize that we will pay for our mobile phone operator a certain amount per month, we can also realize that we should pay a little bit of money to the publisher of a newspaper, that we find a good newspaper, be it online or in paper, because then this media would survive. So we can learn everyone that this is super important. And you can start doing that already today or tomorrow, right? So we don't need our governance to do that. And third is develop tools. And also this we can do. Academics can develop tools to help journalists, because journalists are sometimes involuntarily also purifiers of disinformation, because journalists, you know, they don't have a lot of time, so they just retype a message and then put another headline on it and then push it online. And then we start believing it. Also very trustworthy media, I can tell you from my personal experience, is sometimes just, you know, reframing this information and getting that online, and then even more dangerous things will happen, because we will, in fact, really believe what is in, for instance, the Washington Post or New York Times. And then, not saying, for instance, that they are the ones that are doing that, but I just mentioned some very reliable news brands, of course. And then another very important element is that we need transparency on the information ecosystem. We need that system to be transparent. We need to have more information on what algorithms are used, and we need more information on the data that is actually used and reused. And we need to know whether something is a political advertisement or an editorial message. And what you would see is that in some countries, these platforms are very well in making the distinction between advertisement, political advertisement or commercial advertising on the one hand, and content generated by news media or by consumers on the other hand. But in many countries, that's all blurred. So it's in fact paid information on elections, and you would not know what it is. So this transparency is super important. And then, for me, maybe the most important element, and also for that we don't need our government, we can do it ourselves, or for instance, Nick.br can do it, do research, because you need to know what's actually going on and whether we are not solving the problem of yesterday, but we're still looking ahead of the problem of tomorrow and the day after that. So this is something which is the fifth pillar that we used. So this is the multidimensional approach. It's not a silver bullet, but I think it works pretty good. The Commission also filled it up, and I have some slides I will just click through, because I think you guys will be more interested in what happened afterwards. Well, we recommended towards the European Commission, towards the member states. The member states, for instance, we recommended not to play forms of censorship, also not towards disinformation. And for the platforms, we recommended, and the media institutions, we recommended to create a code of practice. A code of practice based on, and there you go, and I really love for your 10 key principles, your 10 principles, we said we need to have 10 key principles that are used by these platforms to make sure that they step up the plate, because they have an important role to play, but this rule should never, ever, ever amount to private censorship, because if they start private, I mean, you don't want states to be in a position of censors, but you certainly don't want private organizations, such as the very large American platforms, to be private censors. So this is what we did. And in fact, it was so wonderful. There was a code of practice that was actually created a few months later. And this code of practice was based on our 10 key principles. And here you go. They should adapt, and this is a very important one, and it is taken up. We have seen results. Adopt their advertisement policies. So it is, like I told you in the definition of disinformation, there is the propaganda element, right? The changing of the public opinion, but also the commercial element, because a 15-kilo heavy baby is clickbait. We will click on that because that's super interesting. Is that possible? We click on that, and by clicking, we raise the amount of advertisement revenues that is received. So what we forced the platforms to adhere to is that they would stop with that kind of practices. And in fact, they were willing to do so, which is, I think, like a giant leap forward. The fact that we have a code of practice, this is something that didn't happen nowhere in the world, especially not in the US, but in Europe we have it. And they are held accountable because they have to give information every month to the Commission on what progress they make on the code. So another one is ensure transparency and public accountability. The third one is ensure that sponsored content is distinguished. This is what I just mentioned. So it should be sure that what is sponsored and what is editorial or made by users is separated and it's not mixed up, which is important. And then another element, and this is what we will see, and we have also, again, thank God, scientific research, evidence for that can be actually a very good business model, is that there will be like a counter filter bubble. So that consumers are in fact interested in algorithms that will give them alternatives. So if consumers are interested in that, there will be a consumer demand. And of course, these platforms are, well, very nice guys, but they will only do anything if they're really, if it's profitable to them. And we have seen that it is profitable to them to break out the information bubble and come up with alternatives. So they have committed in working on that as well. So, in short, break down the filter bubble, which is rather good and important that we start doing that. Then the last 5 principles, very shortly, it's very important that you improve the visibility of reliable information. So if you are on a timeline of Facebook, you also put reliable information to that. And then who is there to decide what is reliable information? Certainly not the platforms, but for instance, fact-checking organizations could, debunk information and put that next to the timeline, and that might be an alternative. They should do everything, not just one thing, but everything together. Well, also the related news suggestions, and then link up with trusted fact-checking sources is important. And then lastly, which is important for the 5th pillar, these platforms should really start providing relevant data on this information. And what you see the platforms do is they give partial information. So they would say, for instance, we have taken down 2.4 billion disinformation websites, which are trolls, right? Not real sites, just fake sites. Not the information they're taking down, but the fake sites that mirror certain news. They have taken that down. But they don't tell how many disinformation sites there actually were, so we don't know that. So they need to step up to the plate. And I'm rather, mildly happy what is going on, but I'm extremely unhappy with the way platforms are dealing with this sharing of relevant data. So we need to work on that. But then again, this is when I finished the report. I gave it to Maria Gabriel. You see her there. It's a very young, talented commissioner. Super happy that we were able to somehow survive. So, and the follow-up of our report is, well, the communication by the Commission, where they just followed up every of our advices, which is a good thing, because then if the Commission likes what we have been doing as experts, that's the most likely option, that it will also be part of the European Commission strategy. And then there is an action plan for the election that is fiercely taken up. And one element I think I would like to light out, and that is the element that was included in our Audiovisual Media Service Directive that is just new, super fresh, and it is with regard to information media literacy. And I have quoted them here completely, you don't need to read that, you can just make a photo or anything. What you would see is that media and information literacy is now a priority within the EU. And this will create a larger societal resilience against disinformation. So a very important key issue is now part of law. And I think that's a very good thing. And media and information literacy is something no one can be against. This is always a good solution, no matter where you're coming from, I would say. So, and then you would also see certain requirements for self-regulation. I will also skip that. And there's one element you have to also take account. And this is something is a common mistake. And I would like to warn the Brazilians against making this common mistake. Because disinformation is big, right? And also here, I understood there's quite a lot of disinformation going on. But please be aware that the more attention you pay to disinformation to people, the more likely they are to distrust the truth of media. And you saw me with the Dutch on the right-hand side and the Brazilian on the left-hand side. There, you can even enlarge distrust in media if you would say, there's a lot of disinformation going on. So be also careful of not, flagging too much the disinformation out. Just learn people to be strong and learn how to deal with disinformation so that they are less vulnerable. Okay, and then I would like to close down with the following. And that is that, of course, the proof of the pudding is in the eating. So we now need to know whether this will actually work. You know this British expression, the proof of the pudding is in the eating, they would say. Well, that's also true here. And that's not the only thing, because we have to look forward. Because standing still is going backwards. Two developments that are now super relevant. I also understood that here in Brazil, that is very big. Communities, for instance, communities through WhatsApp. Those are very important. It's very difficult to find out what is going on in those internal WhatsApp group. There you can have like gigantic filter bubble situation where you cannot check what is going on. For instance, let's say all Jews are, are greedy or something like that. This could be the truth for a certain group. And of course, we have learned that that is a bit of a tricky thing. That's one. So the communities, and Facebook is getting a lot of attention on the communities, much more emphasis, both online but also through WhatsApp. And the second is something that I want to illustrate you by my final clip, and that is, can you start that for me?
We're entering an era in which our enemies can make it look like anyone is saying anything at any point in time, even if they would never say those things. So, for instance, they could have me say things like, Killmonger was right, or Ben Carson is in the sunken place, or, how about this, simply, President Trump is a total and complete dipshit. Now, you see, I would never say these things, at least not in a public address, but someone else would. Someone like Jordan Peele. This is a dangerous time. Moving forward, we need to be more vigilant with what we trust from the internet. That's a time when we need to rely on trusted news sources. It may sound basic, but how we move forward in the age of information is going to be the difference between whether we survive or whether we become some kind of fucked up dystopia. Thank you. And stay woke, bitches.
Thank you very much. This would be, for me, the last sentence to say, this proves that we need societal resilience, because against deepfakes, there's nothing we can do. We need to have societal resilience, and we need to start building that right now. Thank you.
Next, shall we open for a Q&A session? And those who are participating remotely can also address your questions by our chat. If you are in the premises, just ask for the mic, and that will be taken to you. Thank you, and good morning. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for your talk. She's speaking Portuguese right now. Thank you. My name is Pia. I'm a journalist, and I'm part of an organization of the civil society called Intervozes, which is very close to the topic of disinformation in Brazil, and we are after some answers. The report of the European Committee also inspires us a great deal. However, the Brazilian reality is quite different from the European one, especially as in that scenario addressing diversity, which is different from the European Commission, and the media as part of that core topic. But I would like to hear a bit more from you. Much has been said about the role of the judiciary in terms of fake news or disinformation, not only during elections, but after that, as that is still a fact as part of a governmental strategy and a government communication tool in our new presidency. And we are trying to get serious answers from the judiciary power in terms of what is considered to be fake news or disinformation that could lead to damage and harm to our democracy, and that should be removed from platforms, websites, in a way to defeat disinformation. And I did not hear you talking about the role of the judiciary. I would like to know if you have, if you had considered that, if you had included that as part of the content analysis, and how could it relate and make the legal participants accountable for that. Once we understand that this is key, and it's no longer accepted that platforms are the ones to define or decide what is supposed to be real or fake news, and how can the judiciary interfere?
Thank you very much for this very good question. And of course, I'm aware that the situation is different here. And I tried not to say that every part of our solution would be great also for Brazil. However, I would say that I try to address the judiciary because, of course, I'm, as an honorary judge myself, I'm very much in favor of honest, independent legal decisions on that what is defined in law. But as I also try to explain, is that what we're talking about is not illegal, right? So there's no hatred, there's no defamation, there's, well, so there's, so you would not have a legal foundation to act against this kind of disinformation. And the argument I try to make is that there's not just no legal foundation, but that there should also not be a legal foundation to act against disinformation because of two reasons. First of all, it would be detrimental to the freedom of expression to actually directly act against disinformation. We've seen at least the court cases by the European Court of Justice, right? So it would be outside of the scope, and it should stay outside of the scope, at least as long as we find the institution of the European Court of Human Rights a trustworthy institution, but this is like a bit of a joke concerning the trust and the truth relationship. And secondly, remember the picture of the mushrooms. They're mushrooms, so if we really want to act against those sources, they will just pop up somewhere else. So I would say, although the judiciary is extremely important, let they deal with hate speech, defamation, incitement to hatred, and that is important that they actually take that up. But for the other elements, we need to find other solutions also to avoid that the institutions of the judiciary is not put under a difficult situation because they cannot act against human rights.
Mais uma questão. I would like to add a comment on that, and I would quote you when you mentioned the scale and speed of distribution of this information online. And I remember that when the judiciary act, in the case of Brazil, they act case by case. It's like a handmade work. It's slowly, because it's a case analysis. And this information is produced in here in an industrial scale. It's like the same challenge that the fact-checking agencies is struggling to deal with the phenomenon, because with the fact-checking use the journalist methodology, and which is not cheap. It's most times it's expensive. You have specialized workers, you have sources, you have to check the information, and to produce this information, it's very cheap. You can do it like a click, and you can spread, as you mentioned, in a very high speed and for a very large audience. So it's really difficult for the judiciary branch to deal with, because there's a long process. The judge cannot act by themselves. They have to act in a response for a petition or a complaint, a formal process, a due process of law. This is why I think it's really hard to get a timely response from the judiciary branch. It's really, really hard. It's the same challenge that the fact-checking agencies in traditional media, why they are struggling to respond in a timely way for those kind of industrial scale disinformation materials.
So, all right, I'm gonna have 3 questions, and then we're gonna go back to Madeleine. So let's see. Good morning. First of all, thank you very much for your presentation. It was very interesting. I'm Rafael. I am a professor at the Federal University of the State of Paraná. And I believe that my colleague already talked about some specifics about the Brazilian disinformation. And what we saw is also a very high distribution of fake news using WhatsApp as a means to promote direct communication with the audience. And you talked about the bubble filters, and it seems that that's mostly used in social media. But for more specific, when you think about the direct communication platforms, just as WhatsApp, it seems much more difficult for anybody to regulate on them, because that you're dealing with private organizations. And in spite of that, you can also have robots actually triggering, massive dissemination of news. So can you please elaborate on that? What is going on at the European Commission? Are you discussing this issue, direct dissemination of disinformation using WhatsApp or some other apps? So, Rafael, where do you work for? The Federal University of Paraná. All right. Okay, all right, so welcome. I think he has more people asking you questions, and then he's going to try to put all of them together. All right, one more question? So, can you please talk a little bit more about the turning point you mentioned? Does that happen, and if happens, when? And can that actually trigger a change on how somebody's going to vote? My name is Evelise. I am from the São Paulo Catholic University. Well, my name is Juliano. I'm from NIC.br. And I'd like to ask Madeleine and Thiago to talk about, well, the report mentions follow-up and studies about this phenomenon and the internet environment. Well, since the Cambridge Analytica issued the social media, the platforms, regardless of how we call them, all these companies that actually provide these communication mediation services, so to speak. Anyway, you cannot collect or gather data for research purposes. So at the time I was working on my PhD degree, that scandal had not happened. So I was able to collect together data in order to understand the specific phenomenon, not disinformation. For my PhD thesis was about hatred. But anyway, it would be key that the academia, that also that we could gather data in order to understand what's going on in these platforms. And Pasquale, actually, when he talks about the black box society, he says that it's key to have information about the practices, or actually that the person, the people themselves do not have that piece of information. That is a means of exerting power on them. So what we have is a very a society that has no equality, because you have some groups that are actually concentrating information and political power. Whereas you have groups, particularly those that are affected by the practices carried out by these platforms, they do not hold this information. They do not have any data about what's going on. And with that, well, the civil society could organize itself in order to really think about governance means. So to have some groups perhaps following up on that. So that would be very helpful also in enhancing the quality of those platforms, and that we can also improve the whole environment and then perhaps have a positive impact on democracy. So I'd like to hear from the two of you about that.
Okay, so I will start with the WhatsApp question, which is, of course, a very important question, especially here for Brazil, but it's all over the world. You see more and more these communities that are relevant, and I also try to touch upon that. So what we try to do is to come up with more or less future-proof solutions, and of course there is no such a thing as a future-proof solution. But if you look at our 5 pillars, they might also be helpful. So, because if you don't focus that much on the content of the message or the source of it, but you focus on the other elements. So, for instance, make sure that if people write on WhatsApp or read stuff on WhatsApp, that they also are confronted with other news media, because then they can realize, okay, so this is what my Uncle Tom is saying, but in fact, if you look at the newspaper, you see something else, or if you look at online media or whatever. So that's the one that could even help for that. Then media and information literacy, it might also be a solution for this WhatsApp bubbles. Thirdly, well, the tools to strengthen consumers to find out whether what Uncle Tom is actually saying in this WhatsApp message on, well, I made an example of Jewish people, but I can also make examples of all other groups, even, you know, white men of 50, for instance. So it would be that consumers need to have tools to find out whether it's actually correct, right? So all men of 50 years, white men of 50 years, are now growing small horns on their heads, right? So you would have consumers that are able to distinguish whether that's actually, you know, possible or, you know, a possibility or not. So I would say, like, that is also a solution that help. And then also the transparency of the information ecosystem will also help for that. And the 5th solution would be research. So I would say it's not that there is no silver bullet, but what we say is we try to, you know, by looking at the different angles, take the problem from there and act. And of course, we will not have the solution, and it will be very detrimental to society, but we can try to, you know, to lessen the harm by doing these things and start with them soon. And then, well, research is an important element, and that's also your question, of course, which was very correctly. So what would be the tilting point? When would actually people start, you know, believe what's there and change their voting behavior? We don't know because we need to do research to find out. So Oxford is doing excellent research of just asking thousands and thousands of people, really relevant tests of the group to be able to say like general remarks, ask him, okay, so you were confronted with this and this information, did it change your mind in voting? So then you would know, research. You need research to do that. Otherwise, and for this research, and that's then again Giuliano's copy as a question, what kind of research would you need, and would it be possible if and as long as these platforms don't hand out data? So as you maybe understand that I'm not so much in favor of regulation, because I'm afraid, first of all, that it will not be future-proof what we're doing, because it's the problem of tomorrow that we have to deal with, not of yesterday, and we don't want to regulate tomorrow because we probably will just shoot at the wrong target. Secondly, we have human rights involved, and therefore regulation is pretty tricky. Thirdly, well, this is not illegal stuff, so why would we do it? But there is one reason why I might consider being in favor of regulation, is that if the platforms will stop refusing sharing data, then we need to force them to do that. So if we want to regulate something, they should be more or less forced to share data. But then again, their argument, which is also a fair point, is that we have the GDPR, we have the General Data Protection Act. So we cannot even share that data. And for that, I propose, and this is also in our report, to have specific scientific centers that are completely trustworthy, that give under certain conditions access to data and algorithms in a safe way, so that the data protection arguments don't count. So you would have like a specific group of trusted academic excellent institutions that would do that, use that data, would not share it, and then the output will be generalized in such a way that it's not detrimental to privacy. So that would be the solution to that.
I fully agree with Professor Madeleine. Actually, I believe that we do see a movement facing that. We have mentioned Facebook. Facebook established a partnership with the Social Science Research Network, and many researchers, including Professor Pablo Hortelato from the University of São Paulo, they now have access to data so that they can carry out research on social media. And there are many other research centers that received now this possibility of carrying out research. And I agree that we do need to have access to these data, not to make them public. There is also, we need to think about privacy, confidentiality, but it's also important that we cannot access our data, but they should be used in a very ethical manner. Even Cambridge Analytica, they all started with a research. Crowder, he was a researcher for the Department of Psychology at the Cambridge University in the United Kingdom. So everything started with the research. But eventually, the data gathered was used by a political marketing company. Well, let's have 3 more questions, and then we're going to have Professor Madeleine answering them again. Well, I'm João Carlos Caribe. I am a master's degree student at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. With regard to actions in order to fight disinformation, we understand that from a subject standpoint, Well, we need to have a people's capacity to discriminate what is truth from what's not true. But Madeleine also talked about cognitive bias, and that's the point of my point of interest. It's very complex to manage cognitive biases, and we know that they are exploited in order to have, for example, a piece of information being disseminated amongst specific groups. So I'd like to ask her to elaborate on that. Are there any studies or any measures tackling cognitive biases? Because it's hard for you to directly also handle that. So I'd like to hear a little bit more about the cognitive bias, please.
Olá, meu nome aqui é Zaidan.
Well, my name is Zaidan. My question is to ask you to go in depth on a graph you shared about the lack of trust regarding news on the internet. It's really, the graph with Brazil and the Netherlands. Well, I do not know how much you know our country, but you certainly know the Netherlands. So perhaps if you can talk a little bit more about that to also help us to understand what's going on. Over the last couple of years, we have not talked much about digital inclusion. Well, because we have advanced a great deal on that, but access to internet and to social platforms is still not as big as it is in the Netherlands. And in Brazil, what we see is that people have access to mobile phones. That's how they access the internet. And to me, that's very different from actually really have a digital inclusion. So my question is, why do you think we have this difference between the trust level between Brazilians and the Dutch? Is it because of there is enhanced lack of trust on traditional media? Or is it because people really fail in distinguishing the truth from what's not true? So would people in the Netherlands be more able to discriminate what is true from what's not true? Or is there any fact that leads them to trust more on organizations? So if you can please elaborate on that. Thank you.
Bom dia.
Good morning. I am Rodrigo. I work for MLADSON. That's a news agency which works with data protection and antitrust. I have a question to Madeleine about that intersection. At the time of last year's report, some groups, they were quite disappointed because there was no recommendation for an antitrust investigation recommendation at the different platforms. And the reason for that was, let's wait for the self-regulatory approach. And if that is the case, we may apply such a tool. 1 year later, what is your take on that? Do you believe that antitrust should still be waiting for some other actions to be made?
Wow, all excellent question. Thank you so much for that. Let's start with the first one, the cognitive bias. What to do against the cognitive bias? I would say we cannot do anything against it because it's human psychology, it's emotion. It's like, what can you do against the fact that people fall in love? You cannot. So it's a fact. The thing is, however, that if people are aware of their cognitive biases, they can choose to also look in other stuff. And they can realize, okay, so I click on this because it feels good. But I've learned in media and information literacy that it's also good to look at something else. So you cannot help it. It's just a reality, it's psychology, and this is just very good to know. We know this thanks to academic research that this is really going on. So that's my answer to your excellent question. So the second question is the graphic I showed you. Well, this graphic is part of the Oxford Reuters report, and I can really recommend you because there are also many other graphics, but this was the one that really stood out for me because I have the theory of trust and truth decay that are interconnected. And why would Dutch believe online media more than Brazilians would? Well, it doesn't say why, so that was not researched. But what we do know is that the Dutch media landscape so far, because this is also has been researched, is very diverse. So there are still quite a lot of newspapers, both online and physical. There is a very huge amount of different kind of broadcasting organizations. There are many video-on-demand services, and there is quite a diverse news coverage also, and a very strong public broadcasting organization. So probably the media landscape at this moment in time is still quite strong, and therefore there is an opportunity for the Dutch to also look into other stuff and then realize, no, it's not true. The 50-year-old men do not grow little horns at this moment, because they would see that. So that would be one reason. And another reason is that the Dutch, we have access, very easy access, like over 90%, even elderly people. Almost everyone has access to the internet and has access to news media. And what we've even seen is that young people watch more news media now because of the digital, because of the social media, than they ever did before. And they don't just look at their timeline or at WhatsApp, but they also just actually go to websites of the public broadcasting organization, but sometimes also of a foreign media. You see, young people are very much interested in the Netherlands in foreign media, so they also get a broader perspective. And that has a very funny reason, because there are so many nice comedians that make fun of, you know, either the governments in the US or in other countries in Europe. So young people like to see that, and then they become interested in news. So we are very lucky. And are we lucky, and are we like the ideal situation? No. This is also, it's fine now, but also for us, you see media companies struggling. And of course, the access is okay, but media companies are struggling, and time is also scarce. And your point was also, well, we have more mobile access here. That's also relevant. And then and I saw wonderful, yesterday I was already at nick.br, and I got some really great research that is done by nick.br that actually shows what is the situation of access to, well, you probably know it, you can also look it up on the website. And I think this kind of research is super important, because if you see that there is not a lot of access to online media physically, then that is a thing you could do something against. But you would only know if the research is done. And what I really loved of this nick.br presentation is that nick.br is completely independent. They are not reliant on government funding, so they can decide to do the right research. I could recommend nick.br to keep on doing good research that makes it possible for us to understand what is really going on. Also with regard to the access. Okay, so that was then, and now the third question, a very good question, very critical, because exactly this is like the Achilles heel of the report, is why did you not recommend antitrust measures then? And should we not now start antitrust? We have seen that yesterday the American Federal Justice Department announced antitrust research towards the large platforms. The thing is that at that moment in time, we realized that if we would go for the antitrust, then we would not have the platforms work on the things they should be working on, because then they would just say, okay, we wait for that. And we didn't want to wait. So what we did is we used the antitrust, and if you read the close reading in the report, we used it as like how to say, a sword of Damocles. Do you know that? It's like something that is above a sword that can just, if you don't live up the expectations, it will fall down and will chop off your head. So we used it in that way as a threat, like regulation or antitrust research. And then there's another element, well, which is relevant for you maybe, and you probably will know, is that if you look at antitrust laws, what exactly would you want to research? Because if you would have like a general inquiry, you would also have to look into other media companies that spread news. And when the media companies and this is a bit of like inside information, but I'm happy to share that with the world now, it was a long time ago, they were not that happy because they realized, okay, if there will be antitrust research, it will also be on us. Because if you want to have a sector inquiry, you need both the platforms that provide news, but certainly also the other news providers. And that was why there was a certain reluctance. Last question you had, should we do it now? That's not up for me to decide, but I think it's very important to hold them accountable and to find out whether they are misusing, and also are misusing personal data in this whole power play of them. And we need to take care of that also. And also just use the GDPR, right? Because there are very valuable instruments in the GDPR also to hold them accountable and make their life a little bit, well, less easy, to say it politely.
Well, we still have one final round with another 3 questions. We have another round with 3 more questions. I have, it's not really a question, but it's more like to raise a hypothesis. One of the main conclusions of that study is the need of illiteracy or news literacy, and that has to do directly with the European Committee and the Brazilian context. I do support media literacy, of course, but we have a illiteracy general problem, and moreover, we have a distinction in terms of economic and political access to information and literacy. And my comment is, based on this material or the discussed material, would you say or would you imagine any paradigm change or any different emphasis in terms of conclusion if we consider the reality where some baseline problems such as ours, such as a difficulty to access information or illiteracy, would that lead to something else? Media literacy is great, but that requires a permanent medium to long run efforts. We'll have elections next year, and maybe we won't be able to wait till then, and maybe we should start with some more urgent measures. Good morning. Professor Madeleine. Hello, I'm here. What happened during the dialogue between the European Commission and the platforms once that report was published? What has been implemented from the code of practice, if that has been used as a guideline, and if they do not answer or fulfill those demands, what will the European Committee do in terms of antitrust and some other possibilities? I mean, what will be the concrete implementation of the new measures? And in case that does not take off, the European Committee is addressing the possibility of implementing antitrust and maybe some other actions. My name is Jonas. I am a researcher and a journalist in the Brazilian Internet Commission. I am a Rafael Evangelist. I'm a professor at the University of Campinas. I am a sociologist and anthropologist. You have talked about your rather refractory approach as to the regulatory issues. and considering the platform regulatory aspects as part of that information ecosystem and rewarding programs to bad information or disinformation, wouldn't you say that we still need more strict regulatory measures, not just in terms of antitrust measures, but also some other measures that will emphasize platforms' business models, that will reward data flow in a deregulated way? The greater the data flow, the higher will be the ability of data collection and greater surveillance and vigilance. It seems that today platforms, they have their own system to reward information report regardless of the type of the information, being that a real or fake news. There are some cases where we see quite clear the idea of a landscape and an ecosystem of people and institutions which are economically benefiting from this sort of idea exposition throughout the communities. That's it.
May I ask a question too? Yeah. One of the pillars of your mentioned the multidimensional approach, and one of the pillars is protect the diversity and sustainability of the news media ecosystems, which I fully agree. But my question is, the EU response to that challenge was to pass a new copyright directive, a new copyright framework. And my question is how to avoid the unintended consequences of that copyright directive, especially for the freedom of expression. And this is particularly interesting for the Brazilian context because the same response, in the same debate, it's arising nowadays in Brazil.
Okay, wow, you are wearing me out with 4 questions, but I will do my best. So let's start with the last one first. So protect the diversity and sustainability. You can do that in many ways. You can use state aid for that, or you can avoid unfair competition, which is very important, by leveling down the regulatory system. So that is also in this Audiovisual Media Service Directive I showed you a very important element, is that now video sharing platforms will fall under a form of regulation. So that is a more level playing field towards regulation. So that's one element. The other one is the copyright reform. It's true. This is presented as a solution, but we also have our hesitance whether this will actually be the solution, and whether this copyright directive will not make things a little bit more complicated because the new instruments are not that clear, so there is a lawyer's paradise. So the question is, will this copyright directive actually will help? We don't know yet, we have to find out. It will also depend on the implementation in the member states. So there is a lot of uncertainty on that. But what we do know is that if you have good state aid for news media in such a way that, of course, they're completely independent, and if you have a more level playing field, because, as you know, broadcast is heavily regulated and all the online media are not, we have changes in that respect as well. So hopefully that will strengthen the media landscape. Okay, so that's my answer to that issue. And of course, on the copyright, there will be in Florence, where I teach also copyright in the digital, we have a very nice executive training seminar exactly on this issue. So please come and visit and have a lot of fun with us talking about this new directive. Okay, and then let me go to the first question, because you are saying, in fact, well, it's very urgent. Media and information literacy is all well, but in fact we do not have any literacy, in fact. So, keep on dreaming, this media and literacy will not be good enough and certainly not urgent enough. And you, of course, are right. It's not a solution for now. It will be a bit of a longer-term solution. And then what would be a more urgent solution given the fact that the elections are coming up? And that is a very difficult question. And for that, we can also look at the platforms, because the platforms were willing to actually be more transparent about electoral advertising in Europe. So why should they not do the same here, right? So the platforms, you can just in this part of the world say, hey, platforms, in Europe you are upholding these rules. Let's start doing that also here in Southern America. And what we did with the European Commission, there was an action plan towards the European election. You can also find that on the website of the European Commission. And there you see how platforms are forced to report every month their efforts with regard to transparency, for instance, on electoral information. So you could, start talking to the platforms. How should you do that? Well, unite as many countries here as you can, find a way to do that, and give pushback and refer to those rules that they are apparently willing to adhere to. So that could be one of the solutions. But you would not hear me say very fast, well, start cutting down the mushrooms, because I understand that that is something that you would want to do. And I would say you can cut down the mushrooms as if they are trolls or bots, which are just fake websites that are non-really existing websites. For instance, a fake website of a national paper. I mean, no problem. Also on the basis of intellectual property, you can just take that out. But take the content down. That might be, and I don't know if that is a saying in Brazil as well, but in Europe we use the saying, don't throw away the baby with the bathwater. Hey, that's nice. So it's a really international, global thing. And that is, of course, the risk. Although I can understand that you go crazy if you see what they're all saying, and that, well, okay, with like the white man of 50 that all are growing horns is, okay, doable. But imagine all the very vulnerable groups that really suffer and things that seem to be extremely detrimental to democracy. But still, if you are a Democrat, you want to protect also the freedom of information. So it's very difficult to start then cutting down the mushrooms, I would say. So there is no silver bullet and you have to do everything, but I would say most urgent have those platforms to be super transparent about when there is political advertisement and when not. Okay. And then the second question. You would say, what is the concrete implementation of this high-level group? And of course, I had many more slides, and some of the slides were on that as well. In fact, there are some actions taken. For instance, the action plan, which is really, well, first you have the communication, that was more or less a copy of our advice. Then you had the action plan. Then you had the Audiovisual Media Service Directive and the Copyright Directive. So in fact, they try to really do a lot. Is it enough? Should we not have regulation? Well, we've seen, and this research is conducted right now, that with regard to the European Parliament election, the disinformation campaigns were not that big and not that influential. So we are still waiting for the official results coming up, but it might have worked a little bit, but maybe even enough. So we need to wait and find out whether that was the case. If the platform really failed, then of course we have this sword of Damocles hanging above their heads, and we drop that down, and then they're up for regulation, for instance, for the sharing of data, or antitrust measures we could take against them. But the problem with the platforms is that for them, this is the low-hanging fruit. Platforms are in fact willing to do something against the disinformation because they have bigger problems, and for them it's also good reputational-wise. So it's not, I mean, you can force them and they will probably listen to that more than they, for instance, do in antitrust fields or in data protection, because that's more difficult for them to deal with. But transparency on electoral advertisement, for instance, for them, and even Facebook asks for regulation. Facebook asks for regulation. They want to have regulation on this. And there's also an advantage for them because they can uphold those rules internally, but it would be a very good anti-competition measure towards the smaller platforms for who it will be much more difficult. So, you know, be careful what you're wishing for. And try first to have the scientific evidence that things went wrong for the European Parliament election, and then come up with regulation or antitrust measures that really target the problem and make them and force them to act. Third one, and then it was like I could hold three, and the third one was also with regard to the action plan. It was your question. And could you maybe, because I had a little bit difficulties also understanding the translation, so could someone, because you had a question with regard to the action plan, right? Could you, yeah, there it's coming up. Sorry for this.
My question was about the business models of
Yeah.
platforms.
Yeah.
I was asking if, don't you think that we should do something to regulate those business models that are in the source of the problem, the source of our problem?
Yeah, exactly. And this is exactly what the consumer organizations have been telling. We need to do something against these business models. It is something that would be a good thing, but then it's not very likely that it will happen because we saw there is no majority to do that. So what you could try is, and this is like also one of the tools we suggest, is, you know, motivate or force them in a reputational way towards those alternative outside of the filter bubble models. And then I think what would be the best is that new platforms would start, right? Because now Facebook and Google seem to be super powerful. But this is also a few years now. And then how about if there is an alternative model that is very good for consumers and that consumers would actually want to use? Because we have this academic research proving that consumers do not want to be in their bubble. They would like to have an alternative to their message, for instance. And consumers start disliking the misuse of their privacy much more now, of their personal data. So, you know, like, I don't know how that is here in Brazil, but what we see, for instance, in Europe, there are much more people now vegetarians, because there was like a strong civil society campaign against, well, harm for animals, but also it's not good for the footprint. It's worse for environment if you eat meat than if you don't. So what you see is that the Dutch are now, well, there is hardly any Dutch that eats meat every day anymore. There are very good alternatives right now. So you could even, by, you know, creating a civil society movement, push towards the creation of a new form of platform. I mean, I would go there instantly. Honestly, I don't want to be on Facebook. I don't want to be on Twitter. I don't want to be in WhatsApp groups. I just don't want. And I'm sure that's true for many others. And even those that are not that literate or media literate, you know, everyone understands that it's not a good idea to give up all your personal data or to be in an information bubble. So if there's a good alternative, and it can be created here, then let's all go to this Brazilian wonderful consumer-friendly platform.
Bem, nós...
All right, so because of the time, we have to close. So we had a very productive debate, very clarifying, a very comprehensive debate. We actually had 4 rounds of questions, so some 14 or 15 questions. And the high level of this discussion happened because of our outstanding keynote speaker, but also because of the audience. We have outstanding researchers, activists, journalists. So I'd say that the critical mass of our country is here with us. So I'm very, very happy to see the results of this first session. And I'd like to invite you all to participate in our afternoon sessions. We will have more opportunity to interact with other Brazilian speakers and also with our international guests. I believe we have some announcements, but I'd like just to close and thank you, Professor Madeleine. It's really a great honor to have you with us. Thank you very much for your brilliant participation. It's certainly really raised the bar. Thank you very much.